Do I clip it in here? Somewhere in the neck area? It's a little, probably should have worn not this necklace tonight. Pants. Let me just put this on. Is that good? Okay, cool. Yeah, I am Dakota Sexton. I'm a creative coder and front-end engineer at White House Custom Color. And tonight I'm going to talk really briefly about animation using a really silly side project that I've been working on called Ultra Basic Coffee. This is very much an in-progress side project, but you can find it on GitHub if you're interested. There's also a very limited demo up on Netlify right now that we're going to take a look at. I more recently do React development, but I come from more of a background of CSS, and I knew that I wanted to work on a website full of these very simple, short animations. To do this on like really any other portion of the page, I knew that I probably need to look into scroll-based animation libraries, but it turns out you actually don't. To be able to tell whether or not an SVG is overlapping with someone's viewport and to trigger an animation, you can use something called the Intersection Observer API, which allows you to do asynchronous monitoring. And it also allows you, I'm going to show you really quickly how to use Intersection Observer with a custom hook. Essentially allows you to, well, you can't really see the boilerplate right now because you're just going to see more of the custom hooks boilerplate. But we're going to use useState, useEffect, and useRef. useRef is really important for returning a mutable object that we're going to be able to use to keep track of a DOM node, and it's going to persist for the life of our component. We're also going to use useEffect because when you want to update your ref, you always want to do it in either useEffect or useLayoutEffect. And then we're also going to use state to have a sort of stateful definition of whether or not we should be triggering our animation. And by default, we're going to define some state that's going to be false so that our animation can be paused by default. And then here's some relatively similar boilerplate to what you might write with vanilla JavaScript. Essentially, we have inside of our useEffect, we have a constructor, constObserver equals new intersection observer. And then inside of this, essentially inside of this constructor, inside of these curly brackets, we can define the callback that we want to fire when an element has been like, quote unquote, observed, or as intersection observer would put it, when it's intersecting with the viewport. Typically, intersection observer is going to fire a callback by default when something's overlapping with the viewport, but you can actually configure that differently. I'm not here. Directly after the constructor, you can also see threshold 0. That's essentially a configuration object. And threshold 0 means that whenever any portion of an element is overlapping with the viewport, I essentially want to fire my callback. And then there's also a little bit of cleanup involved because you want to make sure that as soon as a callback fires, that you're not blocking anything else that might be happening with your web application. Then this gets a little bit more fun to me because once you go far enough to being like, hey, I'm going to use intersection observer, I'm going to fire off this callback, and I'm going to do that within this custom hook, you can actually even have a little bit more fun, and you can start bringing in animation. And to do that with this const variance, what I'm actually doing is I'm defining a start and end state for my animation that I'm then going to implement with an animation library called Framer Motion. Essentially, I have an SVG that's inside of a larger div, and I've set overflow hidden on that div. And I'm just positioning that SVG outside of what's going to be visible inside of that div for the pause state. And then with play, I'm going to let framer motion enter a little bit of interpolation where it's going to slowly animate that SVG much closer to its original position. To define a framer motion component, you would say motion dot and then your element. So here I have motion dot SVG. And you can also see that there's a div. And the div is kind of the visibility of what you want to monitor. So that's why I'm saying ref equals ref, because with the mutable object that I've created with the use ref hook, which I have also essentially also passed to use on screen, which, by the way, I completely took from a website called usehooks.com. I've learned a ton about the applications of hooks from usehooks.com, so I really recommend it if you're interested in learning more. Essentially, I'm passing that to the div, and then I'm saying that I have some logic outside of this SVG that I want to use to define the animation. That's what variance equals variance. And then you'll see pause and play refers to the start and end state in that object. And then I've written a little bit of short circuit syntax. So I said, hey, I want there to be this animation, but I don't want that animation to be triggered until on-screen returns as true, which, if you remember, is essentially part of the original state that we're establishing. And that's about it.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Dakota. We're good. We're good. Yep, you're perfect. That's everything. Next up, our second lightning talk speaker is Ben Ragsdale, who's going to talk to us about CSS in JS and some work that he's been doing recently. So Ben, we got the lavalier for you as well, if you'd like. Sure. Perfect.
Good evening, everyone. I'm going to talk about CSS and JS very briefly. Thank you. You guys are getting like a real chew for CSS tonight. You must be really excited. I'm calling this emotional CSS and JS, the basics, because I'm using the emotion CSS and JS library. And that color is what I think their color is, which is pink-ish. This is going to be pretty brief. My name is Ben Ragsdale. I'm a UX developer, and here we go. So basically, I just want to start with what CSS and JS is. You've probably heard of it. It's what it sounds like. It's a pattern for creating styles in JavaScript. And sorry. Sorry, I heard an echo. I got kind of freaked out. Anyways, it's primarily used with JavaScript frameworks like React and Vue. You can use it with just plain vanilla JavaScript, but I haven't tried it. And I think it would be really interesting to try, but for our purposes, we're just going to use React today. Oh, another thing is that CSS and JS is typically used with libraries like Emotion. Another big one is styled components. There's also JSS, I believe it's called, and there are quite a few other ones too. I like Emotion mainly for the fact that when I Googled CSS and JS, it was one of the first that popped up. Okay, so why CSS in JS. And the main one for frameworks is to connect styles directly to components. Components, and I'll use React as an example here because that's what my demo is in. You know, components are already JavaScript and HTML. So you might as well bring CSS into it, like allow them to come to the party, so to speak. They also, it's easier to avoid unused CSS because if you tie CSS directly to a component, you know that the CSS is only for that particular component. There's no other, you know, element that might be using that class or those rules. It's just that thing. And I think that makes changing styles easier because you know, okay, if it's a button, then here's where my CSS will be, and it's not in another page. I mean, it can be if you want it to be, but it can also be directly there right with the component. And it also makes dynamic styling easier. Okay, this is more verbose than I remember writing, but that's all right. Styles are defined in JavaScript files, particularly component files. The styles are mainly defined using objects and template literals. And the way that emotion and I think style components works this way is that when you create these styles, you put them into, say, a template literal or an object, you know, with a const. Those styles are then, a class is generated, the styles are put in there, and that is put at the top of the HTML page in the head. Okay, when to use CSS in JS? Basically, you can use it whenever you want. For JavaScript applications, I recommend it with React, Vue, Ember, things like that. But it's basically advantageous to use it with any component-based system. So I'm going to show you some examples. I said that inline CSS and JS is a thumbs down, but not necessarily. I guess it depends on what you want to do. But this is a good example of what you can do without an actual library. You can do this just straight up in React. You can define your styles and then just plop them directly into the style tag. This is a really good way of doing it, I think, using styled components. And basically the way it works is that you basically create an element here. You put the word style before it, and then you use a template literal, and you can define all of your styles in good old CSS. And you can also nest things like Sass. You can nest, you know, hover states, all sorts of stuff. Objects using emotion, and again, this is a styled component, but it's with an object. It's the same idea. You know, you have the style and the button, but here you create an object. And this too can be nested. You see I have a hover state. This is for a button. And you can also see over here this automatically generated class for it. Okay, so now is the time for my little demo, and it is little. So I created a very simple. Sure. Yes. Sorry. Okay. Is that good? All right. So I created a pretty simple app in React, and basically it's just a form. We're already on the form, in the form component. This is what it looks like. It's breathtaking, I know. But basically, actually, I screwed up the design. The design was supposed to be outside of the box, but anyways. Okay, so I'm just going to do a quick demonstration. So basically, I have a lot of styled components here, or I have really just one. but I have this const fun color. And what this fun color is doing is defining the color. It's a variable, essentially. But it's saying that if the empty prop is true, then I want it to be white. And if not, then I want it to be this pink, basically. And you'll notice that I'm using that variable here in my styled form, and then here again in my label. And down here is where it is in the actual sorry. It's basically, where is it? I did practice this. There it is. Okay. So here you have the color equals fun color. So basically, I say up here that if empty is true, then this equals this. But what I'm doing is I'm tying, wait, I did it a little wrong. Sorry.
It's on form, I think?
Yes.
Form header there? Yeah.
Yes, okay. So I'm tying the empty prop here to this color, right? And basically I have a handle submit that if the form has fields, then you set empty to false, which will change the color, essentially. And so if you go here, you type in my name, and this changes colors. That's it.
Is it on?
It is on.
Good.
It's on, and I can see it coming through on the stream here.
Microphone check.
So many microphones. Perfect. Cool. Well, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Jason to the stage. Jason, take it away.
All right, cool. As Brandon mentioned, I'm Jason Webb. I'm a developer advocate at a company called Accessible 360. We're just across the street, basically, on the heart of Calhoun Square. So it was a pretty long commute to get here. I'm just showing off something from last weekend. Last weekend was the IoT Hack Day, if anybody went to that or heard about that. And I was part of a team. I captained a team to build out a prototype dashboard that would be fully accessible for keyboard and screen reader users. Point this in the right direction. You know how to do it. No. Yes. Yep. This is being prepped and cleaned up right now. I'm going to put this on GitHub pretty soon. Farther away. Closer. It's going to smack it in the middle. So, yeah, good. Microphone. Okay. Yeah, this will be released on GitHub pretty soon. I'm cleaning up the code a little bit, but I just wanted to kind of show an example of something that I'd work on for fun. Again, just it's an IoT-related dashboard, so you can manage all the sensor data, live sensor data, set up triggers, outputs, do events. Just using a screen reader, anybody should be able to use dashboards like this. And I just wanted to share something pretty and cool that I've been working on that fits the theme of the talk. The talk I'm going to give tonight is on web accessibility. I moved into this developer advocate position back in July, and I've been a career UI and front-end developer for my whole career. And I've been very interested in accessibility, as I'm sure a lot of you are, at least peripherally. What I've definitely found out in the last 3-4 months has been that there's a lot of great resources out there. But until you can actually sit down and observe someone who experiences technology differently than you do, there's a lot of ambiguity, question marks, subjectivity, or things that seem subjective. But when you can actually sit down and see someone use a screen reader and go, oh, you can't check out. That's obvious. Like if they can or can't do something, that's very, very clear how that works. Evaluating exactly why they can't do that on a technical level is not super difficult if you know what you're looking for. It's only been a few months, like I said, and learned a lot of cool stuff. So I'm hoping to impart some of the insights and interesting tidbits that I have learned both as a technologist, but also just as someone who's interested in equity and social good in the technology space. So tonight, we're going to be talking about accessibility. Yeah, like I said, I've got a nice little ghost picture because it's Halloween. I had to make something Halloween-y. But I didn't want to risk having a talk on accessibility seems scary. It was like too many puns were possible, but that's as far as we're gonna go. Maybe. So tonight we're gonna be covering a few things. We're gonna try to broadly cover a basic introduction to accessibility because there's more than just technological solutions. There are cultural solutions, workflow solutions, and things are not just on the shoulders of developers either. There's aspects of this that apply to business development, project management, design, content strategy, all sorts of things. So we're going to start out with just what do I want to define accessibility as based off of kind of people that I talk with and work with. Get into some of the basics of why it matters beyond the obvious from like a legal perspective, what are the business benefits, what are the impacts of accessibility. As developers, we're going to be very interested in how do we actually build accessible things, and that's going to lead into some live demos. And I'll fire up a screen reader, fingers crossed that it works with all the live demos. You never know, but I think I've gotten the hang of it, so we'll see. It might work. After that, once we've built a couple of things and seen some actual code, we can use that as a lens to talk about testing. A lot of us at least work with testers, so it's important to know if we're looking at something that we've built in the past or we're building it right now, how do we check that for accessibility and what are some strategies we can all use. Going beyond the technology, this is probably my personal favorite section, kind of how, as a participant in a company, being on a team, especially when there's all these different layers and concerns and pressures from different perspectives, how do we make a difference at any level, whether we're junior, senior, management, whatever. So I wanted to kind of share a few ideas that I have on that. And finally, some links that I have been collecting and use daily, often primary, secondary sources for learning about accessibility. But before we even dive into the technological side, the workflows, the legal side, the business ramifications, I think it's really important to kind of look at what accessibility is truly about. Like, what is the most important core issue about accessibility? And to me, it's about empathy. Without empathy, none of this stuff needs to happen. I mean, we need to have that empathy as a starting point. This is what drives all the law, all the legal aspects, the business aspects, the personal, professional aspects of learning accessibility. Accessibility is also, you can also think of it as a process for reducing and removing barriers to access for people that experience technology differently than you would do. There's a lot of different ways. There's a lot of different perspectives to think about, and it can be a little overwhelming. But I wanted to give kind of a broad overview. When we look at the medical community or talk with lawyers, there are kind of some broad categories that we can look at as areas of interest. So areas, conditions that can cause or result in barriers to access or things we have to think about. Some of the most obvious are physical limitations. So if you have joint disorders, arthritis, missing limbs, things like that. Another one, auditory, if you have partial or complete hearing loss. Visual, so if you have partial or complete loss of vision. But you can also have reduced or increased sensitivity to different colors. And there's many different types of combinations of that called color blindness. But there's also a category of less visible impairments, and these are cognitive. So typically these include, learning, memory, perception, problem solving, for the sake of kind of having this talk be a little more coherent, and it's a debatable topic. I'm including personally behavioral and mental health disorders. Depending on the field, depending on who you talk to, those can definitely be considered separate from cognitive, but it makes sense for us to put them all together just for this. And interestingly, every one of these types of categories can affect all of us at any time. We're talking about permanent, but there are also temporary conditions. So any one of us can go through a surgery or an accident and start experiencing some of these conditions either temporarily or at a low level in a mild way or in a very serious but short-term way. Some of the examples that I've been thinking of are if you've had a broken limb or experienced vertigo after getting an eye exam. If you're trying to get an Uber home, trying to use your phone when your eyes are dilated, you would benefit from accessibility in that situation. So this is an area where we can all, at least first or second hand, empathize with temporary impairments. There's also an interesting category. The last one is situational or circumstantial. So imagine what happens to your cognitive abilities when you're in a high stress environment in a disaster zone, distracted, or if your mouse is broken. All of a sudden, you're a keyboard-only user. Their websites, your apps have to be accessible in that way. And just in the last day or so, I've heard some interesting examples of people having issues with screen glare. That would obviously benefit from the same sorts of solutions that we're building for people with low vision conditions. So there's a lot of crossover between people with chronic permanent conditions and conditions that every one of us experiences either once in a while or daily in the right circumstances. Getting into some of the why, we can think about some of the legal aspects, the business aspects, and again, there's there's really one very simple point to make that ties all of that together. Why does accessibility matter? Because it's the right thing to do. Like, to me, end of list. That kind of sums it up pretty well, but we do have to expand on that when we have business and legal requirements involved, because sometimes we all know the real world is gray, circumstances are complicated. Sometimes what seems like the right thing to one group can seem like the wrong thing to some others based off of very different parameters. And this is where the legal system comes to our aid a little bit. There are a number of really key laws and case law and acts on the books that are still being worked out in the court system. And I can definitely dive into some of the really interesting recent implications of some of these situations, but the most important laws to know about are the Rehabilitation Act of 1974. This was really the first federal act that was put out that addressed the idea of discrimination based on disability. It applies strictly mostly to federal contexts, so agencies, governments, and any groups that are receiving aid from federal sources. There are a number of amendments that we should know about. Section 508, some of you may hear about in your day-to-day. That's used a lot today. 504 is also out there, and that's more targeted towards the education system. So those are targeting accommodations and situations in the public school sector. And again, these have been around since 70s to the 90s. It's not a new idea that we've been trying to achieve better equity for people for disabilities for many, many years through the legal system. Most recently, the most powerful or the most influential law that we know of is the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA. It was first created in 1990, and it's been worked on, amended since then. And this is the first one that goes beyond the federal context, the government context, and starts to talk about civil applications. So this is a civil rights law that applies to all of us. And it's being used more and more in the last couple of years. But we'll touch on that a little bit in the next slide, but this is really the most important outstanding laws that we're kind of thinking a lot about. But there are many, many others that are international, trade-specific. There's a lot of case law. When you actually get into the field, it's a pretty dynamic environment. But a lot of it stems from what these are establishing. Again, touching on the topic of why are we doing this? Why are we talking about accessibility? Let's imagine that we're doing it from the business perspective. What kinds of benefits and what does it matter for a business to get into accessibility? One of them is simply, for the previous slide, to reduce legal action because of those laws. Right now, what happens is very few cases really reach the point of going to court. What happens is a plaintiff or someone who has problems using a website or an app, they will file what's called a demand letter. They will basically point out the inequity to the company and say, hey, this needs to get fixed. Do you want to do it kind of the easy way or the hard way? And most of the time, the easy way is settling out of court, saying, maybe it's a financial settlement, but it often also involves legally binding actions. It says, we're going to commit to making these improvements in this amount of time, and that's been a pretty effective way. So the vast majority of complaints that happen come through these short action demand letters. So obviously, by taking accessibility very seriously and doing a lot of proactive work, you're reducing the risk for any of those things to happen. Secondly, if you're thinking about accessibility throughout your entire development life cycle, from design, content, procurement, everything, I can tell you from personal experience and also as a consultant doing developer advocacy, working in the consulting area, it is so much easier and cheaper to just do a bit of it throughout the entire process and have it always just be part of your core base requirements, it's just how you write code, because otherwise you have to come down at the very, very end, possibly after all the deployments and testing and certifications and sign-offs have happened, and then a demand letter hits. And you have to work as hard as possible, as fast as possible. And as you all know, even doing non-accessibility related crisis work, the quality is never good. And ultimately, when we're talking about accessibility, it's a matter of software quality. It's usability for a larger audience. So trying to hack a beautiful, well-made, understandable system in a short amount of time are very, very competing concerns. But if you are taking accessibility seriously and you take it on earlier on in the process, there's some major benefits. You can reach a much larger market share. You can even corner markets that have been totally ignored or underserved. So if you're putting it out there, if you're building a rideshare app and there's just one other competitor, if you're doing a Lyft or an Uber, and one of them takes accessibility seriously and one of them doesn't, you're going to get a whole market of people that need your services and can only use your services. And there's also the aspect of marketing and image by engaging in positive, socially responsible work proactively. That massively improves, or it can be used to massively improve your image, your brand image. On the converse side of that, companies that get demand letters and have to hack things together, especially if they go to court and start fighting them, bad reputations, bad press can follow them. And I could definitely point to something like Domino's. They've been in the news a lot recently. They've been trying to get a court case up into the Supreme Court, and it was just tossed back down or not taken on by the Supreme Court. And right or wrong, if they're able to prove their case or not, the fact of them being in the news as the bad guy for the last few months, a year, has had an impact on their stocks. So taking it seriously and putting it out there, even as marketing collateral, but honest marketing collateral, can be a very good idea. One of the big points for businesses that I would definitely recommend, all in all, spend money on talent, not on lawyers. If you just start off by hiring great people that really love what they do and are trying to push the field forward, push your company forward, it won't just be about accessibility. They'll be pushing your company forward in DevOps, in testing, and everything they can because they love what they do. So again, hire great people, and you won't need to hire lawyers. Theoretically, we're in the real world. Some are needed once in a while. But yeah, focus on the talent aspect, and that'll be rewarded pretty quickly. Since we're all developers, we're all technologists, it's really important to focus on what does it matter for us on the individual level in our personal career paths. We're all on different levels, and we all have different amounts of ability or agency within our companies. Again, the part that I'm excited about is near the end, some items that I can give you for acting within your companies. But to kind of hype that up a little bit, a benefit for developers is that accessibility really relies heavily on using native web technologies as they were intended to be used. So obviously, the cleaner the code, the better it conforms to the spec, the more accessible it tends to be. So they go hand in hand. If you focus on making things accessible, it's going to result in cleaner, easier to maintain code, and vice versa. If you make code that's really, really good, it's going to be accessible because that's the way it was designed to work. And now in the last couple of years, I was just talking to somebody, I was hearing some stats, some research that back in 2017, there were somewhere around 800 web accessibility related court cases or settlements or complaints. In 2019, we're on track for well over 3,000. So in the last 2 years, our culture has been shifting and demanding in multiple areas for equity, for justice, and accessibility is an obvious point for that. So if you have a skill or a background or some interest in learning about accessibility, you are becoming more valuable to the market in general. You're becoming more marketable yourself. So I would definitely recommend pursuing accessibility as a skill, just like any front-end technology. It makes you more marketable, even if you're not a developer, if you're a designer, anybody else. Again, it's a team effort. So if we all have a little bit of knowledge, it goes a long way. Finally, kind of stressing the obvious, personal and professional growth is really important. So just learning new things for the sake of learning new things, it's extremely valuable. We're all doing it all the time, trying to figure out how to just get the latest framework to compile or integrate into our project. Why not do something that also has a very direct human impact that is technology-based? So hopefully that kind of justifies some of the reasons why we should be taking accessibility seriously. But as technologists, what we're really here for is the how. How do we build accessible stuff? You know, at this point in the conversation, a lot of the times, there's a lot of blank stares, a little bit of panic of like, wait, I'm supposed to be thinking about how many conditions, hundreds, thousands, all these court cases. If I don't do this, am I going to get sued? Am I going to go to jail? Like, there seems to be so much pressure and so much, there's a high amount of difficulty. How are we supposed to take on this challenge as developers? Luckily, it's not just us. There are other developers throughout the world for the last 30, 40 years that have been thinking about this. The W3C, the guys that create, guys and girls that create all the specifications that we rely on for the web, HTML, for example, they also have a wonderful resource called WCAG. I will say that I think it's technically just like GIF or GIF, it's pronounced one way for other people. I think it's technically pronounced WCAG, but I prefer WCAG, and I'm sticking with it because it has we in it, and that's fun. So WCAG is really a huge help, and it's been around for a long time. It's being iterated on, and there's a lot to it, but there's also some great categorization. If you're able to kind of sit down, read some of the resources, it boils down to 12 guidelines. And even that can feel like a lot, especially for a talk. That could be a talk in itself, and maybe it will be. But the guidelines are based off of 4 principles. So every guideline and the rationale behind them, I think, has a very human element that I'd like to definitely touch on here. First, everything we build, all the content we produce, it should be perceivable. So however it is that you perceive things, it should be available in that type of format. So whether it's audio, keyboard only, screen readers, whatever means you have to perceive content, that content should not be hidden from you. Secondly, everything that we're building should be operable. And again, with whatever mechanisms we all have, that can be keyboard only, mouse, a lot of assistive devices really emulate those 2 devices because those are, you know, the 2 primary modes that manufacturers produce and support. But yeah, everything should be operable, whether you're using a mouse or not. Third, everything should be understandable. This is something that kind of ties in a little bit more on the design content strategy side of things a little bit. We have to use things or design things that are really obvious, that you can't use incorrectly. Just design them well, and also write text that is at a certain grade level. It's clear, it's obvious. You know, if you're building technical software for technical folks, understand that audience and build in some affordances. But if you're building general purpose, general market products, simple is better for everybody. Even if you're a native English speaker and you got PhDs out the yin-yang, if it's simple, that just means you can fly through it faster. So it benefits all of us when content is obvious and simple. And finally, our work needs to be robust. So it has to be easy to be interpreted by different kinds of user agents and assistive devices. Interestingly, we've already been kind of pursuing this in some ways through things like responsive design, progressive enhancement. We've been trying to make things work across mobile devices and tablets, but for slightly different reasons. But we still benefit from having technology that is highly adaptable. So if you're zooming in 500%, or if you're using a tablet as your daily device, it should be, again, all of the four things above it should be possible, whatever device you're using to access that. As I talked about before, when we're talking about how do we build things and the importance of the technologies that we already have, when we're trying to build out these 4 things, our most powerful tool for a lot of people, especially in the age of complex JavaScript-based frameworks that are abstracting more and more of the front end, our biggest, strongest weapon for accessibility has been under our nose the entire time, and it's HTML. HTML is designed to be accessible if we use it the way the specification describes. And that's really something we should be striving towards, using semantic, native, and valid markup. So yes, in our day-to-day, as we're writing code, we're creating custom components, things that have to be compiled, transpiled, CSS, JS, all these interesting, great ways of working with source code, but it all spits out a DOM that browsers interpret, and screen readers and other AT interprets as well. So we've really got to be conscious of the markup that we're producing. And the more we abstract, the more we have to be aware of what we're doing.
Accessibility technology?
Yes, thanks. In my opinion, semantic, native, valid HTML gets us 90% the way towards accessibility. The other 10% comes from a technology called ARIA, again, put out by the W3C, the HTML standards folks. Stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications. It's really just a set of attributes that I'm guessing a lot of you have seen, maybe not even realized it. Just a bunch of attributes for vanilla markup, usually prefixed with aria-something. It can convey things about relationships, about state. So sometimes we're building things that there is no native alternative for. So we're building complex stuff, carousels, autocompletes, whatever, that, yeah, if there was just a autocomplete HTML tag or a carousel, it would be fantastic. But since there isn't, we have to kind of mash stuff together to create this new experience. And sometimes when we have those types of components, the interactions, the relationships between all the different sub parts of that gets muddled, and ARIA helps with that. But most importantly about ARIA is to not overdo it. When you go onto the ARIA website to kind of read a little bit more, the #1 rule that they themselves put out is that no ARIA is better than bad ARIA. So that's a really strong message that I want to get out there. There's a link to this whole talk. I'll have a link to this at the end. The deck is up on GitHub, and you can check it out anytime you want and go on that link. There's some really interesting research that has been put out recently evaluating about 1 million web pages and just kind of statistically analyzing them for DOM sizes, packages used, trying to make potential correlations or suggest correlations between things. And they have been finding that the larger DOMs become, the higher percentage of overuse of ARIA there tends to be. So what tends to happen is as we're writing these abstract backend applications, we're just stuffing divs inside of divs inside of divs, kind of not thinking a ton about the output. And we may, every 1 out of 100 pop in an ARIA tag because it made sense at that time. But then we end up with 5,000 DOM elements, and now we have 1,000 ARIA labels that screen readers have no clue what you were trying to do with. So don't overdo it, that's for sure. Now I think we can, knowing some of these tools and techniques, it's a great time to jump into some code demos. So if we had a mic maybe floating around, we can try. My mouse. We'll see what happens. I can point it as well.
Perfect.
All right, let me know how this looks to you guys, screen size wise.
Yeah, maybe further, yeah.
I've got it local.
One more click.
So what I've got are kind of before and afters because live coding is boring. I'm just spitting out a basic page that I can't enlarge, desktop version. So just a very basic site with a sidebar, a footer, breadcrumbs at the top, some content, nothing all that special. And I'd like to kind of show how little we have to do to vastly improve the experience. And so I was kind of curious, scrolling through this quickly, if anybody just right off the bat spots anything that would stand out to you as a potential problem. So, yeah.
There's no header. There aren't any header elements like H1, H2. There's so many div tags.
Mm-hmm. But you don't like my titles? I named them title. They have a class of title. That's right, though. Yes. Yeah. Anybody else have anything that jumps out? Nothing. So it works, right? It's using the right classes. I'm using my favorite CSS framework called Bulma. It's a nice common sense, what they call, framework. Really, there's no JavaScript. It's just direct Sass going into some pre-made classes. But yeah, I can bring this over into a debug view if I can touch the right thing. I'll give you a little bit of a demo. A little touch on the screen reader world a little bit. Computer is broken. Oh, hang on. How is it doing that?
That's all right. It's doing
I'm keeping it, yeah. Well, it's blocking this. Yeah. Okay, got it. It's magically connecting to what it needs to connect to. Nope. That is so magical. You can hear that? I have no idea where it's coming from or why it's doing that, and I love it. So I'm using a program called NVDA. It's a free open source screen reader for Windows. The two most popular screen readers are JAWS and NVDA. They own at least 80% of the market between them, and they're both Windows only. So if you really want to be testing for, trying things out for accessibility, you have to go where the market is and test things the way they actually use them, which is Windows. There is VoiceOver for Mac. Just understand that is there echo? Is it good? Yeah, it's good. I don't know. Something's turned on. Maybe it's this. Maybe this came back to life.
Nope, we just adjusted some stuff.
So cool. Technology. Yeah. Cool. Yeah, so in NVDA, there's this nice elements menu, so I can go through and dissect the page. All of these things, there are keyboard commands for. So I can navigate. I could do this. Yeah, I know how to use this. So there are, when we have an actual native user, they can fly through this at a rate that would just blow your minds. Their first step is to slow way down for us. But they navigate in both linear and non-linear ways. They can jump between all the semantic elements very easily. So there are keyboard commands for jumping between semantic headers, footers, etc. But if I try to do that, there's none of that. There's nothing on this page. Okay, where's the headers? So as I try to navigate, there seems to be nothing here. So I have to use my arrow keys. It's like, okay, there's links over here. But again, I'm not looking at the page. I'm just hearing Links without context. Why are there links? What are they about? I don't know. Then I get down here and there's more lorem ipsum text. Why is that different than, did I come back to the top? I don't know, it just says lorem ipsum. Maybe I have. So if I go in and, again, I can inspect, you can navigate through all these things, try to find them. There are none. Do, 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 do. Screen readers are fun. So jumping into the accessible example, it's going to look exactly the same because the same CSS is being applied. It's just every bit as responsive and everything like that. But right away, you can see some small but very important differences. We're using actual header tags. We're using what they call landmark tags. There's just a handful of these that help orient screen readers. They can use those keyboard commands to jump to the footer, to the main, to the header, so they know that, oh, navigation is probably in the header, almost always. I'll jump to that, or go to the footer for the copyright or the contact link. It helps a ton just to have things identified as headers, as navs. So if I try to come in, and one of our engineers has a, I don't know what they're called, a flock of chickens. So obviously every single example that I produce has to be chicken themed. Nope. So kind of navigating through this page a little bit again. So I'm on the main. So I think I'm in the footer maybe. Yeah, I'm in the bottom. That's the sidebar. Complementary is sidebar. So just because I've named things with nav, header, etc., the screen reader identifies that, reads it out, so I know it's not just a random link or a list of links. It's the header. It's the breadcrumbs. It's got navigational items in it. That's really important information. And again, the markup does not look drastically different. If anything, it looks a little bit cleaner because it's logical, it's semantic, it's readable. So again, we've made our code better to maintain as well as better for users. It's a big win-win. I'm going to turn off my screen reader. Because what it's doing is it's partially intercepting some keyboard commands so that it can do emulations with them. So it's kind of emulating some of my mouse behaviors, what's called a virtual cursor, so I can navigate. It'll stop when it feels like stopping. Got it. It's super helpful. The installation sound is the best. Some of you who use it know what I'm talking about. So we could go through a second example, a much more impactful example, but I don't want to run over time too much. So I say if we have a little bit of time at the end, we'll jump back to this. This shows more of a practical, interactive dynamic application. Again, just marking up a very simple form, but using semantic elements, associations that are just shipped with browsers. There's a massive difference in these two things. And what I'm going to do is, for the sake of the talk, I just wanted it to be raw code. After the talk, I'm going to go to my code pens. These are all linked through the GitHub slides. And I'm going to annotate what the problems are so you can kind of understand what the befores and afters are really doing under the hood a little bit. But let's go into the future and pretend that we've understood forms a little bit. We've built a little bit of code. Now the next question is obviously from managers, from QA, from everybody else. How do we test this stuff? How do we know that things are accessible? And right away, there's one giant elephant in the room that is a nearly daily question that we get at A360, which is, okay, what tools can we install that just check it for us? You know, it's code, right? Code is is deterministic. We can just write tests and test for things, right? And that's kind of not the case with accessibility. There are aspects of accessibility that we can test for. You can test that the HTML is valid, that you're not using, you're not making up attributes or tags that are not actually supported by the spec. But ultimately, what is really interesting is that all of these tools, every automated tool, the best ones catch about 40% of the issues. And there's some really interesting in-depth research from the UK government that picks apart just about every tool, runs it through basically the worst website in the world that they've come up with as a test suite, and highlights what they excelled at, what they did not excel at, et cetera. And I thought it was a very interesting study. And what they found was, yeah, it's great for syntax, for invalid markup use. We're living with that. That's good. Buzzing? That's not bad. It's not bad. It is something over there, yeah. I think it's adding ambience. So it can be used to flag potential issues, and that's actually something that we use a little bit in our day-to-day as engineers at A360. We can use it to say, hey, you've got like 1,000 images on this page. You might want to look at those. There's no way to really have a tool tell you that all of the descriptions make sense, but it can tell you that someone should be taking a look at them. It can kind of guess and help you out. I also think there's potential to use it for regression testing. So if you are in an advanced enough shop where you can take a snapshot of the DOM every build and then actually do a diff against the previous DOM build and just say, hey, we've just noticed that the DOM is 50% different, a human should look at this. So it can flag deltas like that a little bit. But what it's bad for is, again, that big #1 rule, checking for overuse of ARIA. It doesn't know how much is too much. That's a determination that we have to make as developers. It can tell you what's valid and invalid markup, but it can't tell you what's semantic because that comes from context. You can say, oh, this is a header, but is it in a logical position in the DOM for a header? Does the contents make sense for a header? That can vary because we're all building very different websites out there. Whether our image descriptions are accurate, talked about that. UX for people with disabilities, like do they really enjoy your site? That's not a thing a tool can tell you. A couple of quick ideas to do some testing. Use your keyboard. It's remarkably effective. If you just try to use your keyboard, you can test that third rule, the operability rule. Can you yourself make sense of your site using just your keyboard? Do you know where your focus is? Is there a focus indication on all the interactive elements? Is it being trapped because you have a modal window or some crazy component that is allowing you to focus on things that are in the background and not the foreground? Just by using your tab key, you can run through it and see some pretty obvious issues. Use mobile devices. A lot of us already are, but it turns out they're super popular as assistive devices. Reasons being is their interfaces are optimized for speed because they have screen readers like VoiceOver for iOS devices, TalkBack for Android, and they can be configured for gestural interactions. So people can just use swipes, different combinations of fingers, and they can fly through things sometimes quicker than on the desktop. They can also carry it with them and think about it. Half the laptop here is a screen. If you don't need a screen, why are you using a laptop? So mobile devices are remarkably helpful, and if people have different kinds of motor limitations in wheelchairs, iPads and touch screens are phenomenal because you can have a wider touch footprint. You can use things like touch sticks. There are interfaces that allow you to zone in on regions of the page. So you just have to kind of broadly say, I want to go to the left side, the right side, and using a combination of broad touches, you can make fine interactions possible, but only through a large touch screen. use extreme zoom, so just zoom way in. That's surprisingly useful as well, because people that have low vision will zoom quite a bit in, and have the screen in front of their face, have a large widescreen TV, and then all of a sudden things like focus management, where your keyboard focus is at, those become much more extreme examples. So just zoom in, try that, and see what happens. There's also a number of checklists out there. Creating a checklist is a great internal process practice that you can do. But I like this one from Vox Media. They have a really great checklist that breaks it down for designers, for developers, for different business people. So quick time check. How are we doing? Because I can jump or stay. We've got small. 5 is good. 5 is great. So with these automated tools being incomplete, what really happens in the real world when these things become legal complaints and issues is nothing beats human feedback. So if you're going in front of a jury or a lawyer or just a law firm who has done a little bit of accessibility and evaluating your case, you can come to the table with audits, reports from Lighthouse, 100% perfect scores, and then if someone walks in and then just is like, tap, 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 I can't check out, I can't buy, all of a sudden all those perfect scores are a whole lot less meaningful because an actual human proved them wrong. And that's what you really need to focus on is when you're doing testing, automated tools can be used to supplement and zone in on areas, and they can lighten the load by looking at the most simple, tedious aspects, just validity of code, semantics, et cetera. But a lot of accessibility has to do with usability, and the best tool we have for that is each other. I want to run through this because this is my favorite section. Like, what can you do tomorrow if you're going to work wanting to do a little bit of progress or advocate for accessibility? Well, I already gave it away. Whatever you're doing, advocate for accessibility. If you're a junior developer, senior developer, manager, anything, whatever level you're at, just advocating and keeping that front of mind as a desire is important. If you're someone who comes up with or helps come up with time estimates, MVP requirements, et cetera, just say, you guys rely on me to do the best job I can to write code that protects the company, that serves our users, and accessibility is a core requirement. It's a feature. So it needs to be included, just like we're writing for mobile devices. Secondly, if you're someone working on pattern libraries, design frameworks, internal libraries, build in accessibility best practices and guidance. Do some research and say, hey, here's some usage examples of if you're using our breadcrumbs or our nav menus, here's how we find them to be most effective and least effective. As someone who has had to build and use a lot of frameworks like that internally, just having someone who has kind of blazed the trail a little bit and given us some domain knowledge would have gone a long way if I'm a junior developer. If you're producing content creation tools, make it impossible for people to use them to spit out bad markup. So don't let people lay out articles with tables. You have control over how that markdown or CK editor or whatever, how that gets interpreted. If you're in the design side, create and use personas of diverse people. So include people with disabilities in that core persona workbook. I love this link from, there's a site called Empathy Prompts. It just shows you like little flashcards in your site. You just keep refreshing, and it says, hey, it's like a game. Like, hey, turn off your mouse, and this simulates this. And they give you these prompts that just get you to think differently about using the web. It's a lot of fun. So just make a wheel of empathy prompts and use it once a week with your team, just for fun, but education. Set up keyboard-only, screener-only days, not just for developers, but for your whole company. If it turns out that your accountants or your HR people can't use your internal software without a keyboard, mouse, etc., that means that you can't really hire people. And that may be why you're not able to hire people with disabilities for those jobs. And employment law is very much concerned with accessibility and equity. So you got to make sure that not just the output of your work is accessible, but that the tools you're using to create those things are also accessible. Otherwise, you're excluding a market segment from being hired. Collaborate with people with disabilities. Invite them in for participation testing. Give lunch and learns. Just come by and show you just how they use their screen reader. They don't have to be developers or experts, just to see their perspective. If you're giving demos, every sprint, have someone come by and just try to use it. Best case scenario, your bosses will love you because you've built this amazing thing that is accessible in 2 weeks. That'd be fantastic. Empower people who really care about it. Let them kind of run with the ball a little bit. Empower SMEs, and if they really get traction, that becomes a justification for hiring people with actual direct focus on accessibility. But SMEs can go a long way, just having someone who's the designated advocate to just keep you reminded about that topic. And finally, obviously, I have to pitch. Reach out to companies like Accessible 360, because there are not that many of us. And we have people with different kinds of conditions, and we have a ton of experience. All of our engineers have backgrounds in development and different levels of experience. So they've learned both sides, the usability and the engineering. So sometimes just asking for people to give workshops, do lunch and learns, come to an event, speak like this is also pretty awesome. Hire people with disabilities. That's really the last slide. And just like any other marginalized group, you don't have to hire them to be the token person with disabilities. You can just hire them because they're going to enrich your culture just like anyone else would when you hire them. They're giving you a different perspective, and if they don't want or can't provide expert knowledge of their condition, of their perspectives, or they just want to work, that is just as valuable because they're going to enrich your culture, remind you of things, even if it's just passively. So hiring people and just having them be part of your culture can make a big difference, even if they're not trying to. If you go online, there will be some links to this. Primary sources, the working groups, the specifications, kind of a component library / not component library. Great code examples called the authoring practices. The developers or the authors show you how to use technology, web, or HTML, ARIA to actually build drop-down menus, carousels. Most things you would want, they have examples for. I use it literally every day. Secondary sources, fantastic groups, agencies, groups doing interesting things. Bottom right, I would point you to that if you're interested in content. It's a federal standard for content writing. All federal agencies must abide by the plain language standard, basically showing you how do you write content that is super simple and easy to read. I write technical documentation for my artwork, for my job, and I find that if you can explain things simply, then everybody gets it, and it shows that you really know what you're talking about if you can explain something to a kid. Finally, if you want to go and see the rest of this talk online, there's a QR code, a link. I will post this wherever I can find it. Slack, Meetup probably makes sense. This is going away in like 3 seconds. This will bring you to the live slides. They're all online. And if you have any questions, I'm kind of here as a community member as well. Part of developer advocacy is being a part of the development community as a developer. So if you're working on stuff, you have random questions, find me. I'm on most Slack groups, and if I'm not, invite me. And yeah, just feel free to ask whatever questions you have. And that's it.